Okay, here we are again. Hey, folks, welcome to episode 2 of the Jump the Shark podcast, where we'll be chewing the fat about all things cloud native. I'm Matt Jarvis. I'm joined today by my regular co-host, Gerred Dillon, who's on mute. And also a big Jump the Shark welcome to today's special guest, Daniel Lipovetsky. Welcome to the show, Daniel. Thank you for being a willing victim. We'll be talking to Daniel a bit later on in the show. So where do we start? Gerred, we had over 100 views of our last episode. Pretty unexpected, right?
That is pretty unexpected. Yeah. Great. Not sure I feel about that, but let's go for at least 102 this time.
Yeah, we were kind of planning to keep the bar low, right? Underperform is always best. Make sure no one has unreasonable expectations. Yeah, it looks like we might have to up our game now. People are actually watching this.
Add some production value, you know.
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe not that far. Not that far.
So before we kind of get started, we'd love to have any of you who are watching involved in today's proceedings. So please put your questions, thoughts, comments into the comment section on our YouTube channel, and we'll be keeping an eye on that throughout the show. So I guess we'll get things moving along with our new slot where we'll be looking at some of our favorite things in cloud native news.
How much time?
Super pro. We've even got clips to introduce the sections. So, Gerred, what's been exciting you in the news since our last show?
I think the big one that I really enjoyed recently, you've captured a few here too, but was the Deserted Island DevOps conference that happened. It was this
was the conference on Animal Crossing,
yes,
right? In
yes.
Nintendo's Animal Crossing game.
So they streamed eight talks, and the way they did it was they set up a conference hall. You can have up to 8 people in a single island at a time, and there were 8 visitors. And so they all came and basically sat in the audience, and they basically produced it like a real conference, just in Animal Crossing, and you could watch the slides and interact. It was great. I was thinking of actually like maybe hosting one, but the problem is all your speakers have to play Animal Crossing, right? So step one, that's a bit of a speaker. Well, it only works if all your speakers have that. So I don't know. We'll see. We'll see if another Deserted Island thing comes up. But it was really well produced, and I was really impressed with how they did that. So very, very, very cool. I hope it continues.
Yeah, I watched a little bit of it. I thought it was very cool, but I've not really used Animal Crossing. So, Daniel, did you see any of this?
The Deserted Island?
Yeah.
I did not. I was playing actual Animal Crossing, so I couldn't be bothered. But no, I mean it sounds nice. Sounds like a nice distraction, or not distraction, but something other than just looking at a bunch of faces on a screen.
Yeah, I mean, I've come across conferences in like Second Life and stuff like that before. I think maybe Second Life ought to have a Second Life now that we're doing all these virtual conferences. So, are you both Animal Crossing players then?
I was just being facetious, but I think the Animal Crossing is probably going to work out better than Second Life because Animal Crossing seems to be outside of the uncanny valley.
Yeah. Someone was saying Animal Crossing is like the perfect lockdown game. Gerred, you played it, right? Like,
I play it all the time.
Because everyone's basically isolated, and people try and steal stuff from you.
Yeah. So you're on your own island. You can go visit other people's islands, and mostly the game's about you owing a massive amount of money to a thieving raccoon, who continuously builds things for you. So
right. So there's definitely real world parallels there with our current situation.
A little bit. Yeah. You capture bugs, and get fruit, get materials, and sell them to pay off your mortgage or donate them to the museum. It's actually like it's pretty fun. Like I don't know why, but I'm very addicted to it. And this evening I'll spend at least 2 hours weeding since I've been out. Like I haven't played in like a week, so I need to go clean up my island, I'm sure.
Wow. Daniel, what have you seen in the news this week that's been interesting?
So the one thing is there's a new release of Kind, which is a Kubernetes in Docker command line tool, and it's a really nice release for anybody that runs clusters on their laptop, because previously, if you were if you brought up a cluster at home and then went to the office or to the coffee shop, you'd run into trouble because all of a sudden the cluster wouldn't be working. You couldn't pull images. It was because of DNS. And now this new release adds another level of indirection, which of course is a way to fix anything. New level of indirection for DNS. So yeah, now you should be able to take your Kubernetes cluster and move it around geographically.
Not that we need to actually move around much. You could drive around with it in your car, maybe.
I guess that's true. So that's nice to see. And also you can now have the cluster live across reboots. So if you need to update your kernel, anything like that. So it's nice.
Nice. So I noticed today was this week I think is the 1 year anniversary of the Kates.af website, which is always worth a read. For folks who aren't familiar with that, that's a list of war stories from the Kubernetes world, put together I think by the folks at Zalando, I believe, to start with, and. Yeah, I'm always surprised. Actually, I went back to reread that site. I hadn't read it for a while, and I'm always quite surprised that there didn't seem to be many like massive disasters on there, like total data loss, multiple days, customer downtime, and all that kind of stuff. So I don't know what that says. I guess it's partly maybe we've kind of improved how well we understand distributed systems. I mean, like definitely in the OpenStack days, if you'd done a site like that in the early days of OpenStack, there was like tons of people who were like, yeah, my Ceph cluster like deleted all of my customers' data. What else did we think that was interesting? Oh, so I guess we should maybe touch on the proposal to change the CNCF Sandbox process. That was kind of interesting, right? Should we see whether we can let's just pull that document up and
So to summarize it, there's a lot of changes, and the intent of that proposal, I think, is to deal with some of the issues in the current Sandbox process, right? It's a very political process. There's not much ownership or a impedance mismatch between owners and projects as far as getting the advice and what they need to be successful. And there's still this view, I think, that the CNCF can be a bit of a gatekeeper, and so Sandbox becomes maybe over important when trying to operate in that model. So what this is trying to do is go to a simple majority, bring things in at a bulk, once a quarter into the Sandbox, and generally both lowering and raising the bar needed to get there. Raising in the sense that more TOC members, a simple majority, need to accept it, but lowering in the sense that it really makes it a facilitated place for experimentation, right? And projects that may or may not work out for the future, right? And that risk is, and conveying that risk is very important, right? Because when you move your project over the CNCF and it gets terminated, right, that IP is still maintained by the Linux Foundation. So it's experiments that you truly, really want to run, and if you really believe in it, but it fails, now you have to take that risk of, I have to fork my project, rebuild it from the ground up, right? So interested to see where this proposal goes. And and it's interesting to see where current proposals for the sandbox end up with this new process.
Yeah, and I mean, from what I understood, there was also that kind of breaking that guaranteed link between Sandbox and incubation, right?
That's right. Yeah. Or at least now projects can also be in Sandbox for an unlimited amount of time. So you're not in this desperate march the second you enter the Sandbox to get to incubating as your top primary goal.
Yeah. And I mean, there's a pretty big barrier to incubating. You know, your project's got to be in a pretty serious state by the point when you put that proposal in, right? Which can be a bit of a barrier to folks who are maybe earlier on in that journey with putting together a project.
Yeah, and when you only have a year to do that, I mean that's 20 now. Now it's going to be less than 15-20% of the entire cloud native, like the entire time this entire thing's been around, right? And we're still in a phase, and probably will be a phase always, where a lot can change in over the year of you trying to get from Sandbox to incubating, right? And so this reduces a bit of that stranglehold on more experimental projects.
Mm. Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see how that pans out. I mean, for folks who maybe aren't familiar with some of these processes for how these things get done, these documents are all out in the open. Anybody can go on these docs, comment, raise issues, whatever. The whole thing's done out in the open. So if you're interested in that, do go ahead and take a look at that doc. So any other things that have come up? Daniel, you come up with anything else this over the last couple of weeks that's been interesting news-wise?
Apparently I've been doing nothing but using Kind for the past few weeks, because the other thing I saw was there's this proposal. So Kind is a tool to sort of run short-lived clusters, very now long-lived as well, but short-lived primarily and for development. And typically when you're doing development, you're doing it locally. You're building images, right? So let's say you're working on a controller or some application that runs on the Kubernetes cluster in Kind locally, right? That's going to get built into an image, and it's going to get pulled, and that image may be in production, it would be pulled from some, registry, right, publicly available, et cetera, and not on your laptop. But of course, when you're doing development locally, especially if you're, let's say, maybe offline, you want to be able to pull from a local registry. And so there's this nice proposal, mirrors, I think, other proposals in other projects like MicroK8s and K3D, to sort of annotate some resources in the Kind cluster, so that development tools know what is the local registry that the Kind cluster is using. So that's where they can push those updates, and so you can have a better development experience. And right now there, you kind of work around some of these things by loading images indirectly in Kind, et cetera. But this would provide a nice kind of standard API for development tools to interact with, and get that information from a Kind cluster.
Neat. So it's basically stored inside the cluster where you need to point to access the local registry.
Exactly. And so when you compile, you update your code, build a new image, your development tool, tool chain knows where to push that image. You might have multiple registries, or sometimes you might push into something upstream, and this will help.
Great.
Development UX.
I love Kind. I use it all the time, and I know we use it heavily in our internal development process. Running it inside Kubernetes as well. There was an interesting blog post this week from one of our engineers about all getting kind of pretty Inception-like, but about running Kind clusters inside Kubernetes as part of a development workflow. So you can find that. That's on the D2IQ blog, I think. So, Daniel, you're one of the engineering staff at D2IQ, but you're also core contributor to Cluster API. And I guess that's one of the things that we wanted to talk to you about today. But why don't we start at the start? I'm always super interested in how people have kind of ended up in the Kubernetes and cloud native world. So tell us a bit about yourself and kind of how you ended up here.
Yeah, so I was studying for a master's degree in computer science, and I was focusing on distributed systems and databases, and I ended up doing a summer internship where I was working on OpenStack, and this was back in 2014, and then this was at eBay at the time, and then later I came across this company Platform 9 that was doing also working with OpenStack, and they were doing some interesting things, like a kind of a managed OpenStack product, and I worked as an intern over there, and then I decided to come back. They were getting interested in container orchestration, and at the time, this was, I think, end of 2015. So Kubernetes was just going to its 1.0 release, and so that's sort of where I started. I remember having actually read the Mesos and papers in my graduate seminars, and then looking at Mesos, looking at Kubernetes, looking at I think at the time Rancher had something called Nomad, and sort of comparing them, and Platform 9, we decided at the time to sort of bet on Kubernetes, and so we started building a kind of a managed product around that. And so that's I was part of the team that built that.
And so Platform 9 back in the OpenStack days, my background was in OpenStack for many years before getting into kind of the container world. So Platform 9 in the OpenStack days were all about kind of having a managed control plane and on-prem data plane, right? Is that similar to what they're doing with Kubernetes? Yes.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, like a hosted control plane. Yeah. I think a similar approach to something like GKE, but with your own infrastructure for the data plane.
Yeah, I mean, I remember in those kind of days that it wasn't entirely clear at the start that Kubernetes was going to be the thing that ended up winning that race, right? I mean, I remember OpenStack summits with people giving talks on all sorts of weird combinations of Mesos and Kubernetes, and Mesos on its own, and so it definitely wasn't in those days this clear cut. I think at the start that Kubernetes would end up being the biggest thing in containers.
Yeah, and then of course Docker Swarm was there in the mix, and I actually remember DockerCon 2016 being this kind of awkward. I remember being a little awkward because there was this big keynote and this announcement. Docker Swarm was changing. There was this new API, and a lot of the primitives looked very, very similar to the primitives in Kubernetes. So yeah, so it was an interesting time back then.
Yeah, so I wanted to jump in and maybe get into what you primarily work on out in the community these days. Can you tell us a little bit about what Cluster API is and kind of where it sits and what it's all about?
Absolutely, yeah. So Cluster API, it started. I think it started in some ways, right? All the different. There are lots of. I think there's maybe a spreadsheet that's still maintained by Joseph Jacks, who is one of the people that started the original KubeCon. Anyway, there's a spreadsheet sort of listing all the different sort of distributions or products around Kubernetes, and so there are all these companies, and they were all and still are to some extent solving the problem of what I call, or what the community calls cluster lifecycle, right? Which is, hey, how do I, great, Kubernetes is the best thing since sliced bread, but for application developers to use it, you got to get a cluster up, and then you have to be able to upgrade that cluster and recover the cluster if there's a partial failure, et cetera. Perform migrations, bring parts of the cluster down for maintenance, et cetera, right? So there's cluster lifecycle, right? And all these different vendors were solving the same problem internally, right? Writing their own tools, and at some point, I think the community realized that, okay, we're all working on the same problem. Can we find some consensus and actually build something useful that we can all share? Because at the end of the day, the cluster lifecycle is really not, that's not what the customers are really interested in, right? Customers want to be able to use Kubernetes. They're not interested in, okay, what is this tool chain that you're using to actually manage the cluster. So that was there was the cluster lifecycle SIG, and there was an email shared in I want to say end of 2017, and the email went out, and it's basically this sort of high level idea of, hey, I think we want to find some common solution to cluster lifecycle. Oh, and by the way, we all use Kubernetes, and we like the Kubernetes API and sort of the conventions around it. And why do application developers get to use these great primitives like deployments and replica sets and pods, and and the sort of the spec and the status ideas of, while everybody that's working on cluster lifecycle tooling is like unable to take advantage of that, right? It's sort of living outside, using something completely different. And so the idea was, hey, let's see if we can work on this problem together and use Kubernetes and the Kubernetes API as a way of actually like storing the data, modeling the data, writing controllers to manage the cluster lifecycle.
Sure. So is Cluster API then more meant to run inside of a cluster and have say you need a management cluster in front of it, or does it include that COPS like Big Bang Bootstrap from your local machine, or is it both, some form of both of that?
It's actually both, and COPS. I think without COPS and the experience of that project and the experience of Justin Santa Barbara and Chris Nova, who initially sent this email. Cluster API, it would have been on worse footing. So definitely there was a lot of inspiration from COPS, and yes, there is this. You can use Cluster API to bootstrap, which is part of sort of the COPS user experience that you create, you use the CLI, you bring up a cluster, and then you can continue to manage that cluster, and some of that state is, well, it's not stored directly on the cluster. I believe it's stored on for AWS it might be an S3 bucket. But so Cluster API takes that maybe to the next level, where now the state can actually be stored on the cluster that is being managed. So using for instance custom resources, and so you can bootstrap there's this notion in Cluster API of a management and a workload cluster, and there are two common use cases. One is where you have the management cluster and the and the workload cluster are the same, right? So maybe you are interested in kind of a you have a development, you want to kind of a development experience, you want to just own your own cluster, so you can use Cluster API for that. Bring it up, put the Cluster API control plane on that cluster, and then continue to use it, and own it. And then of course you have the other model where you have a single management cluster, and on that management cluster you've got the Cluster API control plane, but then you have multiple tenants, multiple users that are bringing up all sorts of workload clusters, maybe in different infrastructures, but you've got this central kind of control plane.
And so your management cluster doesn't actually need to have it's just a control plane basically. So it's a pretty stripped down.
That's right. And the original, one of the ways that Cluster API bootstraps is you can use a CLI called Cluster Cuddle, and you can use it together with Kind, right? So you can bring up, let's say, a one node Kind cluster on your laptop, and then bootstrap the Cluster API control plane on this management cluster. It's on your laptop. And once that's bootstrapped, then you use it to create your workload cluster, which might be in a different, might be in some let's say public cloud, right? And once that's there, you can use this Cluster Cuddle the CLI to pivot. That's the word that's sort of used by Cluster API to pivot the control plane to the management cluster. So it means deploying the controllers that are running on your local Kind cluster and deploying them in this cluster that you've just created, and then moving all of the resources, all of the custom resources, and so forth.
So has the focus mainly been around the cloud platforms? I know you also, Cluster API also supports bare metal, which is kind of, I would assume, still the harder bit, right?
Yeah, so the Cluster API, there is actually, there's a project called Metal Cubed, and I think there is a proposal to get it into the CNCF, perhaps a Sandbox. I need to double check, but yeah, it's a project that it has two roles. One is actually booting, let's say, machines over the network, so providing a kind of infrastructure API for bare metal. And then the other half is implementing this extension point for Cluster API, something called an infrastructure provider. So Cluster API doesn't really, like, the core part doesn't really know or care about the infrastructure. It delegates it to an infrastructure provider. And so there are infrastructure providers for GCP, for AWS, DigitalOcean, OpenStack, et cetera, et cetera. You can, you write your own for whatever sort of unique infrastructure you may have. And then that infrastructure provider, right? it's supposed to be able to bring up a machine. And so in the Metal Cube case, right, Cluster API says, hey, I need a machine, and then Metal Cube says, okay, I know how to do this. I can talk to some services on my end, and then those services will actually, let's say boot a machine over the network. In Metal Cube case, the services for doing that are actually is a project from OpenStack called Ironic.
Yeah.
And it's used. Yeah. So there, there's a lot of Ironic has lots of great functionality around identifying the properties of various bare metal machines, and then getting the OS images on there, and et cetera, et cetera. Why not reuse that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I'm an OpenStack OG, so I think it's always pretty cool when you see technologies that have come out of one open source project get reused by another open source project. I know a lot of work went into Ironic over the years. Bare metal, for anybody who's done bare metal orchestration stuff, is really hard, right? The standards involved are pretty flaky. The kind of adherence to standards by vendors is pretty flaky. All this old stuff like IPMI and all these other things. So, they have varying degrees of effectiveness on how they're implemented and all that stuff. Although I think it's been a while since I've used bare metal these days, but there's a whole bunch of new stuff in that space, right? Like Redfish and things like that, which is supposed to take a lot of that stuff and make it more API driven. Your ability to change the CMOS settings and all that kind of stuff on hardware is supposed to have been getting a lot more standardized. But yeah, I love that. I love that Metal Cube project. I think that's super cool.
So, Daniel, what would you consider to be the edges of Cluster API's goals, in the sense of you have many different providers, and they may all offer platform specific functionality, right? How does the Cluster API team decide kind of what goes into Cluster API proper itself and what stays at the fringes, and is that extensible, right? Like of course you could have someone write other CRDs, but is there a mechanism or any considerations around that?
That's a great question. So Cluster API initially, right, the extension points that were there were in tree, were in code, and so there was this notion of machine actuators and cluster actuators, and it was basically, you had to implement. So this is 2.5, 3 years ago. Before a lot, I think, of the development around CRDs. And so yeah, it was more difficult to customize in the beginning, and there was a lot of discussion about, I would say, 1.5 years, almost 2 years ago now, about making Cluster API more extensible, because the contributors to Cluster API are largely the vendors who are building sort of products around Kubernetes, and so everybody has different requirements, and it's very difficult to adopt a project that if it impedes your business needs, you're not going to be able to adopt it. So the current situation in Cluster API is you have the Cluster API project. It has some core functionality, and so it maintains that core functionality, and this is supposed to be something that is useful and valid for a cluster in any infrastructure. So a subset, sort of in the same spirit as Kubernetes conformance, right? It's like these are the things that we believe are common to all Kubernetes clusters. And then there's this notion of an infrastructure provider, which I mentioned earlier, and something called a bootstrap provider. And so without getting too much into the weeds there, I'll just say that, you as a vendor or as a vendor who has, let's say, the need to support a particular infrastructure, you can come and adopt Cluster API and use the community maintained core and bootstrap providers, which is really more about like deploying the various bits on each machine. Let's say kubelet and CNI binaries, etc. You can use all of those, and you can just customize the infrastructure provider, which is great if if you're an expert in that infrastructure, but not in the rest of it. So, and if you are an end user and you want to, let's say, live this hybrid cloud dream, right, where you're deploying Kubernetes to any infrastructure, you can use Cluster API with all of these different independently maintained infrastructure providers, and there are a number of them. The Cluster API docs have a list. I mean, it's all the public clouds, of course, are supported, and then lots of other infrastructures as well. As an end user, you can take advantage of all those, but if you need to tweak something in the actual bootstrapping, you need to install some custom software that isn't, that you can't install or maintain on the cluster itself. That all you need to do is, build your own bootstrap provider, and there's great documentation on how to do that. So it's the project over time has recognized the need for being extensible and making it easy to sort of extend only in those parts that that you care about, while remaining compatible with the other bits.
That's really cool.
So you wrote the blog announcing the V1 Alpha 3 release, right? What was cool in that release?
Oh, I just I think on every level. So there was one of the things that Cluster API up until this latest release had did not support was the idea of control plane management, right? Which is sort of it is the thorniest in my experience, in my view, it's the thorniest part of cluster lifecycle. Especially etcd, the distributed database, right, where all of the cluster state is stored, and which is the only stateful part of the control plane. So that has been added in this latest release. So now you are able to, with Cluster API, bring up a cluster and have a kind of a declarative way of managing the control plane. So, for example, if you want to scale your control plane up, which sometimes is necessary if you want to, let's say, tolerate more node failures, you can use the sort of the same kubectl scale command as you would for your, let's say, deployment. So you can use that against a Cluster API managed control plane. And there are a lot of nice changes for serious production users. So being able to represent failure domains, being able to automatically replace nodes that are unresponsive for for a certain amount of time, yeah, there's been some great improvement to the CLI experience, this cluster tool that I mentioned earlier, and of course the Cluster API documentation, this the so-called Cluster API book, is getting better all the time. really, one of the nicer, I think, examples of documentation that I've seen as far as Kubernetes projects go, and inspired very heavily by the Kube Builder doc. So that's one of the early projects for building custom controllers that use custom resources. So yeah, lots of nice things. Especially if you're serious about using cluster API, to run clusters in production.
Yeah, I mean, I thought the book was great. I had a bit of a flick through preparing for this show just to do a bit of research, and I thought the book's absolutely brilliant. I mean, I think we've generally got a lot better at docs over the years, in big open source projects. The Kubernetes docs have always been really excellent. I think if we look at things like OpenStack, it took a lot longer, I think, for us to get the docs part of that organized in, to a reasonable level where, you could really understand how these things work.
Yeah, the maintainers have really, have taken, the docs sort of seriously, and you can see that there's a nice sort of quick start, but then there are also quite detailed docs for anyone that is wanting to extend cluster API for their infrastructure, for their own bootstrapping. And because it's a project that is it's still the API version is still alpha, right? There are still changes. There's still things that the cluster API is learning. The book really covers well the things that are changing from version to version, and people that are running clusters on the previous release. There's tooling and there's documentation to make sure that people can upgrade or can adopt the next release. So yeah, it's quite nice. It's not something that I think that's typical.
Yeah. Looking to the future, what are some of the big items on your roadmap, and is there a plan yet for Cluster API v1? Are you even when would you like to go v1, or what do you think needs to be there before you can do that?
Well, I think baby steps, but some of the things that are on the roadmap, and the roadmap is is in the Git repo, and it's something that that all the maintainers reach consensus on. Some of the things that we're working on right now, or that actually recently landed, is there's support for cluster API in the autoscaler project, which is great because now you can have you can use the cluster autoscaler, and it talks to cluster API, and it no longer needs to know about the sort of the details of the infrastructure, right? Or if you have some custom infrastructure, up until now you would have had to either fork cluster autoscaler or get your autoscaler implementation in tree. Now if you're running a cluster API, you can you've got that level of indirection. So that was on the roadmap, and that's recently been added. We want to improve the story around dealing with, I would say, I guess the unhappy path, right? There's initially, there's a lot of focus on sort of the happy path. What is, making sure that you can deploy and upgrade and so forth when things, don't go wrong. And now I think we're starting to look at, okay, let's assume that things are going wrong. How do we improve the user experience, the sort of the administrative experience around that? So that's on the near term roadmap. Improving the control plane management, story. And yeah, as far as V1, I think it's if we're talking about the quality of the project itself, I think it's already being used in production. It's quite I would say that has quite good quality. The part that is alpha is the API version, and that is because we still have a lot, I think, to learn. Right? I think one of the powerful things, one of the things that's worked well in Kubernetes is the API. I'm blanking on the sort of the API. Graduation path.
Oh yeah.
Right, that you go from alpha and you figure things out, and you eventually you go to beta, and then you figure things out, but it's a lot more it's slower, and then eventually you're GA, and that's it. You've got stability. So I think the fact that you're seeing alpha in the API group for cluster API is we're still gathering feedback. We still want to understand how do we best model this for end users, because it's not going to serve anybody well if we just say, okay, look, we're in beta, we're the API is good, it's it's solid, and then people come back and say, hey, we'd love to use this, but this model doesn't really fit for us, and then we're not even going to be able to change it because of those API guarantees.
Sure. Yeah. It's interesting because the way custom resource definitions and API groups were done in Kubernetes leads to some interesting constraints, right, around upgrading between those versions. And when you set that storage version, right, now you can only operate on now cluster API v1 alpha 3, right? Once you've deployed that, you can't go back and branch or compose those types. Because I think of the CRDs as really like Kubernetes' type system and programming model, right? But you can only maintain one of those, and that does cause some issues when you do make those considerations around like solidified, right? Because now once you do that, you're now in a situation where you have to go v2 alpha 1, right, as your next step. And I think we see that in a lot of projects. So who's out there using cluster API today? And as a side question to that, if you had to make a prediction of when the first cluster API Kates.af story will appear in the future, when would that be?
Undoubtedly there are already stories. It's just I think maybe engineers are just not finding the time to submit those PRs. So I think that's how that Kates.af is actually backed by a Git repo. Anyway, so I think there are a number of vendors contributing to cluster API, VMware, and so previously, there's a large group of engineers who came from Heptio, and then VMware acquired Heptio, and but originally there were actually a lot of contributors from Google. And this is about about 2 years ago. There's lots of contribution from Google that has, I think, faded a little, faded somewhat. There's contribution from VMware. There's contribution from Microsoft, from the Azure platform team. There is Weaveworks, of course, D2IQ. So there are a number of vendors who contribute to Cluster API and are building products on top of Cluster API. And this is something that that the project has discussed, but it's also sort of, I think, come about organically. Is that vendors who are building on top of Cluster API typically aren't exposing Cluster API to end users. Cluster API is really building primitives building, like the kind of a platform for implementing great solutions, like cluster lifecycle solutions. So anyway, so there are those vendors, and then there are some end users. The biggest one is New Relic. They've been using Cluster API in production for a long time. So I guess maybe tweet at one of their engineers to get some failure stories. But they've been really great, giving feedback from the end user perspective. So I've been really fortunate to have them.
And then from getting new contributor standpoint, what areas do you think Cluster API could use the most help from the community, and what's the best way for people to get involved and start participating in that?
It's there are lots of things to work on. If you're interested in the sort of the bootstrapping, if you're interested, if you work on something like kubeadm, which is another cluster lifecycle SIG project. So there's lots to do at that layer. If you're interested in custom resources and writing controllers, there's lots to do there. And then of course, if you want to start or help maintain an infrastructure provider, so if you have expertise in AWS, GCP, DigitalOcean, whatever it might be, those are independently maintained, but still there's kind of there's a pretty close relationship with Cluster API. Lots of feedback, lots of learning that goes between infrastructure providers and sort of the core project. And the best way to get involved would be, to check out the book, check out the repo, bring up your own Cluster API managed cluster using Kind on your laptop. That'll just take a few minutes, and join the weekly meetings that we have. They're pretty, they're very well attended, I would say, and very welcoming to newcomers. We've got a time slot sort of for people to introduce themselves, ask general questions. So it's please come. You'll be very welcome, and we'll be glad to have you.
Nice.
Awesome. Thank you, Daniel. I think that wraps up this part of it. We've got a few minutes left. And one thing I really like that other podcasts and whatnot have done in the past is some picks. So, pick 2 or 3 things that you're interested in. Does not even have to be technically related. It's always interesting when hearing about someone's like favorite chef's knife. So whatever it is on your mind, what have you Googled lately, gone and done? Figure we can all go around. Starting with Matt, why don't you go first?
Well, I think we've all had plenty of time to Google over the last few weeks. There's
right.
The one thing there's been no shortage of, right, is time spent on the internet. I have to say, my one of my highlights of the last fortnight, if not the last year, was Josh Gad's reunion of the Goonies on YouTube. So I don't know whether perhaps I can just share that quickly. So where are we? There we go. So yeah, Josh Gad brought back the entire cast and all the creators of the Goonies, including Spielberg and the writers and various other people who've been involved in it. A lot of these folks have stopped being actors quite a long time ago. Some of them clearly are still people like Sean Astin and Josh Brolin and stuff. But it was awesome. I literally had tears in my eyes at parts of this show. It's all for charity. They reenacted various scenes from the Goonies, and actually tonight, I think I've already missed the start of it. Was the Back to the Future reunion, which again is should be an absolute work of genius. So you can catch up with those things on YouTube.
Awesome.
And for I actually loved Josh Gadden, the new well, not new, I guess now, the Beauty and the Beast from a couple of years ago. So he's great. I remember seeing him in the Daily Show years ago, I think.
Isn't he? He's the snow. Isn't he Olaf in Frozen as well?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yep, and the leopard in Zootopia.
Wow.
Yep.
A face made for animation.
Yep. Daniel, do you have any more picks, Matt?
Yeah. So I had the other thing that I which kind of frightened me in equal frightened me and fascinated me in equal things was this AI meme generator. Let's see whether we can find this.
We should find a way to post all these links to somewhere. Maybe just
we should do. We'll maybe post them in the episode. Where are we? Oh, this one. So I'm not actually going to generate memes with this because I think we've got the potential to be extremely not safe for public consumption here. But this is entirely AI generated. So you've got a bunch of memes there and it just like somehow decides what things to put on it. And a lot of them are frighteningly accurate, which is kind of crazy. I don't know what that says about humanity, that we're either super easy to predict or I guess this is also in the realms of. Have you seen the Kelsey Horse Tower bot on Twitter?
Yes.
Which also has the capacity to on quite a few occasions actually sound like something Kelsey Hightower would have said. So yeah, that I lost an hour of my life flicking around with this AI meme generator.
That's awesome.
Let's get rid of that.
Daniel, what do you have?
So this is I have a 5.5-year-old son, and we've been inside for a while, and I thought get a new board game to play, and I found one. Actually, I think on a recommendation from Ars Technica, something called King Domino, which has been out for a couple of years, and apparently it's pretty popular, but I had no idea about it. And I get this game, and it's fun. It's just sort of tiles, and you gotta match the tiles. And that's where you get the the domino, and you kind of kingdom building, right? But what I didn't realize is that as you play, every time you part of the play is you get 4 more you get 4 cards from the deck, and you have to sort them. And there are 48 cards, so you end up sorting like double-digit numbers. And so my son is sorting numbers. I'm like, okay, that's good, a little arithmetic. And then later, when you're done with the game, you have to add up all the scores. And the way you add up the scores is there are these crowns that are on the tiles, and there's some multiplication. So he's been doing all this multiplication. I'm just sitting there. I feel like a like a ninja parent or something, like, wow, I'm getting my kid to do multiplication without. I had no idea that this was part of the game. It's a fun game. That's just something on, totally as an aside. But yeah, that was my pick.
I'm sold.
Yeah, I'm gonna order it right now.
Gerred, what about you?
Let's see. So I've been working on a Clojure client for AWS lately. I really enjoy Clojure in my free time. So I was going back to the
last show, right?
Yeah, right. This is where I go on a deep rant for 3 hours now. So I was watching through AWS Meets Clojure. That was at the not this past Clojure Conch, but the one before it. It was introducing like a generative AWS API, and they went through the entire API description for AWS, and that's usually bundled with either the JavaScript or the Java modules. And so they ended up going and generating out all these different modules for working with AWS in a very Lispy way. So really cool, and so it got me into thinking of how can I do this with Kubernetes and the Open API spec there. as well as any CRDs in the cluster, and try to do discovery. So you have this full live REPL for Clojure and Kubernetes. So that's WIP. I wanna get something I can open source there soon. But that got me reading a whole bunch of things.
You're making me and Daniel look bad now, Gerred. This is like me and Daniel are talking about the Goonies and Dominoes. Talking about auto-generating specs.
Right. It's my excuse to play with Clojure in the evenings. And that got me going back to Beating the Averages by Paul Graham, which is about them using Lisp to build their startup. And then to counterbalance my own head, I went and read The Lisp Curse, which is another fantastic essay about why Lisp will never succeed. That might be a bit strong, but it's, I don't disagree with the article. And then this all followed up with there's a fantastic talk that was given about 7 years ago called Narcissistic Design, and it's kind of an anti-talk. It's a Stuart Holloway's the founder of Relevance and now Cognitect, and the entire talk was about things you should do if you want to become so essential and you want to keep your job. And it has everything like bleeding your types across the boundaries and only using DSLs instead of actual data models, and just all these horrific things that you see. Like these are perfectly well written, well agreed upon standards out in the world that when you look at it, you realize like, oh my God, that's insane. And so it's a really good talk worth watching. Takes about 45 minutes, and kind of you see a lot of why you see a lot of this in Kubernetes actually right now, especially with bleeding and gRPC, really with bleeding types across the boundary, and it's arguable whether or not that's a good thing, but it is the state of things we do now, where those of us who program a lot of Kubernetes, we spend a lot of time generating code, like probably an inordinate amount of time generating code, and it makes me wonder if there's some sort of expressiveness there that's missing from the way that we're doing things. So that's what's been on my brain lately.
I was hoping.
I'll throw a fun one in. I've been checking out, and I just ordered. I've been playing video or tabletop games online. So there's a tabletop simulator. You can run any board game, and I discovered a game called Villainous through it, and I just ordered. And you play one of a bunch of Disney villains, and you're competing against each other as Disney villains to achieve an objective. And there's fate cards that can be used against you as the villain. So if you're playing Ursula, like Ariel could be used against you, right, to reduce your power. And so it's kind of a pretty cool.
Sounds like a game my kids would like.
Yeah, it's pretty fun.
Cool. Okay, well, I think we've come to about the end of this week's episode. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Gerred. And thank you, folks, for listening. Please do subscribe to our channel, which you can find below on YouTube. And also follow us on Twitter at WeJumpSharks. Thank you to our sponsor, Day2IQ. And we'll look forward to seeing you for the next episode, hopefully in 2 weeks' time.